In Fresno, California, violence has a memory. It lingers in neighborhoods long after police tape is removed, after court records are filed away, after names fade from headlines. Some figures become legends, others become warnings. Robert's Phantom. Galvan belongs firmly in the latter category, a man whose story forces uncomfortable questions about gang power, prison control, and the limits of punishment. Galvan's name is inseparable from the Fresno Bulldogs, the city's most dominant and enduring street gang. Unlike flashier criminal organizations, the Bulldogs did not rise through spectacle. Their power was built slowly, through territory, intimidation, and the kind of street-level violence that embeds itself into a city's daily life. For decades, the Bulldogs have shaped Fresno's criminal ecosystem, influencing neighborhoods, drug markets, and prison yards across California. Within that structure, reputation is everything. And Galvan's reputation was one of authority. Law enforcement sources and court documents would later describe him as a high-ranking member, widely regarded in gang culture as a shot caller. The term does not imply leadership in a corporate sense. It means decision-making power, who lives, who dies, who is punished, and who is protected. Even behind bars, such authority carries weight. Galvan did not emerge from obscurity overnight. His criminal trajectory followed a familiar path, escalating from street-level violence to organized, high-stakes crimes. Robbery, kidnapping for ransom, assault with a deadly weapon. These were not impulsive acts. They reflected planning, coordination, and an ability to impose fear. Judges responded accordingly. Sentence after sentence was imposed until the message was unmistakable. Robert Galvan would never return to society. For most defendants, multiple life sentences represent the end of movement, the end of leverage, the end of threat. But California's prison system operates under a different reality. Inside, gangs do not dissolve, they reorganize. Influence does not disappear, it migrates. And inmates serving life terms often become more dangerous, not less, because deterrence loses meaning. By the time Galvan entered long-term incarceration, he was already known to correctional authorities. His affiliation mattered, his history mattered, his temperament mattered. He was not viewed as a passive lifer, but as an active, destabilizing force, someone whose presence altered the dynamics of entire housing units. Prisons like Courtroom State Prison exist for men like Galvan. Designed to house the state's most violent offenders, Courtroom is a place where danger is expected, not exceptional. Movement is limited. Cells are reinforced. Surveillance is constant. And yet the system relies on a delicate balance. Classification decisions, housing assignments, and the assumption that isolation can neutralize threat. But isolation does not erase ideology. It does not dissolve gang loyalty, and it does not eliminate a mindset built on dominance. Within prison walls, Galvan's name continued to carry weight. Disputes followed him. Tension followed him. Correctional officers understood that placing him in a cell was never a neutral decision. Every pairing carried risk, not just for inmates, but for staff responsible for maintaining order. What the public rarely sees is how fragile that order can be. In 2010, Galvan was housed with another inmate at Courtroom, Robert Johnson, 29 years old. Their cell was not a battlefield in the conventional sense. It was a controlled environment, monitored and regulated. But control in prison is never absolute. There are moments when the system looks away, moments when violence happens faster than intervention allows. Johnson did not leave that cell alive. The killing would later be described as gang-related, a phrase that often conceals more than it reveals. It suggests motive without detail, structure without transparency. What is clear is this: Galvan, already serving multiple life sentences, had killed again inside the very institution designed to contain him. For prison officials, the murder was a nightmare scenario. For prosecutors, it was unprecedented leverage. And for the justice system, it presented a crisis. What punishment remains when life imprisonment fails? As investigators built their case, they were not just examining a homicide. They were examining the collapse of deterrence itself. The usual tools, longer sentences, harsher confinement, reduced privileges, had no effect on a man who already had nothing left to lose. But even as the state prepared to pursue the ultimate penalty, Galvan would demonstrate publicly and violently that the danger had not passed. Because the next time Robert Galvan erupted, it would not be behind steel doors or concrete walls. It would be an open court. For most inmates, multiple life sentences are intended to be the final word, a clear signal that society has removed any chance of return. For Robert Phantom Galvan, they were only a prelude. His crimes prior to Courtroom, the robberies, kidnappings, and assaults, had earned him decades behind bars, yet they did not diminish his capacity for violence. In fact, within the unforgiving ecosystem of California prisons, they reinforced his authority. Inside the walls, punishment and power coexist in a delicate, often contradictory balance. The more dangerous a man is perceived to be, the more attention he receives from law enforcement, from rival inmates, and from gang networks. Galvan was acutely aware of this dynamic. He understood how influence operates where violence is currency. Loyalty, fear, and reputation are interwoven, and any misstep can be fatal. Prison intelligence units would later describe Galvan as highly strategic, capable of asserting dominance without immediate confrontation. To some inmates, he was a leader. To guards, he was unpredictable. To administrators, he was a ticking time bomb. And all of it took place under the surface, in whispers, glances, and small acts of intimidation that were invisible to the casual observer. California prisons are designed to contain men like him. Segregation units, limited contact, constant monitoring. These measures aim to neutralize risk. But containment is not a guarantee. It is a framework built on assumptions, and assumptions can fail when a man's will to dominate exceeds the system's ability to restrain him. That latent danger became impossible to ignore when he was housed with Robert Johnson. Prison officials did not anticipate that the convergence of two men, histories of violence, and the social pressures of gang hierarchy could explode so quickly. What followed was a stark reminder that even in maximum security, life sentences are not a shield against lethal intent. Johnson's murder was more than a single act of violence. It was a demonstration that Galvan's reach extended beyond the streets and into the very system meant to control him. For prosecutors, it provided a grim opportunity. The man they had already condemned for prior crimes had proven that confinement alone was insufficient. For prison officials, it forced a reevaluation of risk. How do you manage someone whose danger cannot be measured by conventional metrics? As the case against him unfolded, investigators pieced together a narrative that painted Galvan not as a man pushed to violence by circumstance, but as someone continuing the patterns of his life behind bars. Each act, each decision, each calculated move reflected the same ruthless logic that had governed his criminal career outside prison walls. Violence, it seemed, was not a means to an end. It was the end itself. The trial would soon expose this volatility to the public in a way that few imagined. What happened next would challenge every assumption about courtroom security, inmate behavior, and the limitations of the justice system. Because if Corcoran State Prison could not contain Robert Galvan, could any controlled environment? The answer came in 2012 when the system faced its most humiliating failure, the courtroom assault. By 2012, Robert Phantom Galvan had become more than a name in a police file. He had become a symbol of the limits of the system. He was already serving multiple life sentences, and yet the murder of Robert Johnson inside Corcoran State Prison proved that confinement alone could not contain him. The state had filed charges for the killing, and Galvan's case was set to go to trial. What followed would test every assumption about courtroom security and the very concept of control in the justice system. Courtrooms are designed to project authority. The judge presides, deputies line the walls, defendants are restrained, and proceedings follow a strict hierarchy. The purpose is not only to administer justice, but to contain the unpredictable. In Galvan's case, all of those safeguards were in place. He was shackled, heavily monitored, and considered a high-risk defendant. Yet when the trial began, it became immediately clear that no precaution could fully neutralize the threat he posed. During proceedings, in a shocking breach of security, Galvan freed himself from his handcuffs. In an instant, the courtroom, the most controlled space in the justice system, descended into chaos. He attacked his own defense attorney, the very person sworn to protect his life, and then turned on a correctional officer, stabbing him with what would later be described as a makeshift weapon. The judge ordered deputies to intervene, and the room erupted into a frenzy of shouted commands, scuffling, and terror. The assault had profound implications. For the prosecution, it was evidence that Galvan could not be managed within any conventional structure. If a man could violently dominate a courtroom filled with officers, deputies, and legal personnel, what hope existed for managing him in a prison setting? For the defense, it was catastrophic, a public demonstration that their client could not be trusted with life, let alone liberty. And for the justice system as a whole, it was an alarm bell. The man had exceeded the capacity of every control measure available. Security protocols were revised, courtrooms were reinforced, and deputies were temporarily doubled in number, yet the question lingered. How do you contain someone who has proven capable of violence, even when the system is at its most structured? Galvan's attack was not a desperate lashing out. It was calculated, deliberate, and terrifyingly effective. It showcased a mind unbound by the rules that govern ordinary prisoners, a mind trained for dominance, whether on the street or in the halls of justice. This incident became a turning point in his prosecution. The narrative shifted from one of a convicted murderer to an uncontrollable threat, a man for whom society had no safe containment. Expert testimony emphasized the risk he posed, not only to fellow inmates, but to anyone in proximity to him. The courtroom assault reinforced a central truth. Conventional punishment alone was insufficient. By the conclusion of the trial, Galvan's actions in the courtroom had become central to the argument for the ultimate sentence. The state sought the death penalty, arguing that life imprisonment had already failed to prevent lethal violence. The courtroom attack had made clear that Galvan's danger was not hypothetical. It was immediate, tangible, and extreme. As the legal process moved forward, the state framed the issue starkly. Some individuals are beyond the reach of conventional justice. Galvan was such a case, a man who had demonstrated repeatedly that he could not be contained by walls, bars, or rules. And in California, that left only one option. The sentence would come in 2013, but before it did, Galvan's case became a case study for law enforcement, corrections officials, and prosecutors nationwide, a reminder of the unpredictable intersection between gang culture, prison life, and the ultimate limits of control. His path from the streets of Fresno to the courtroom floor had proven one undeniable fact. Once a man like Robert Galvan begins a life of violence, even the most secure environments cannot fully contain him. By 2013, Robert Phantom Galvan had become more than a cautionary tale. He was a symbol of a system pushed to its limits. His trajectory, from gang enforcer to lifer to inmate who killed inside a maximum security prison, had placed him squarely at the center of a question that few courts ever confront. What do you do with someone life itself cannot contain? The courtroom incidents, including the assault on his defense attorney and the stabbing of a correctional officer, had left no doubt in the minds of prosecutors or the presiding judge. Galvan was not merely dangerous, he was uncontrollable. The standard tools of incarceration, segregation, restraints, supervision, had all failed to restrain him. Life sentences had not neutralized the threat he posed to others. During sentencing, the judge framed the case with chilling clarity. He described Galvan as an extreme danger to others, emphasizing the lack of viable alternatives capable of preventing further killings. This was not just a punitive decision, it was a statement about risk management, about public safety, about the limits of the criminal justice system. In imposing the death penalty, the court signaled that there was no remaining measure capable of ensuring safety while allowing Galvan to live. California law permits the death penalty for murder, but Galvan's case was unusual. Unlike most death row inmates whose crimes were committed outside prison, Galvan had committed lethal violence inside the very institutions designed to contain him. His case raised uncomfortable questions for corrections officials and legal scholars alike. How could a prison system fail so completely? And if life sentences cannot prevent death, what purpose do they serve? Galvan was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, home to California's death row. Conditions there are among the strictest in the state. Solitary confinement, minimal movement, heavily restricted contact with other inmates, and constant surveillance. In theory, death row represents the ultimate containment measure. In practice, it is a liminal space, a place where condemned inmates exist in stasis, their threat controlled but not erased. Yet even as he began life on death row, a paradox emerged. California had placed a moratorium on executions, meaning that while Galvan was legally sentenced to die, the state had no immediate plans to carry out that sentence. He was simultaneously condemned and preserved, isolated and yet alive. This tension became a defining feature of his existence behind bars. For the public, the sentence represented justice. For victims' families, it represented closure. For prison officials, it represented a degree of safety. But for Galvan, it was neither an endpoint nor a release. His influence within Fresno gang culture continued to echo beyond the walls of San Quentin. While his case became a touchstone for discussions about gang control, prison violence, and the limitations of the death penalty in practice. The sentencing marked both a conclusion and a beginning. Legally, his chapter of violent acts was sealed with the ultimate penalty. Practically, his story continued, raising questions about how the system manages those it cannot rehabilitate and how society defines justice when it confronts a man like Robert Galvan. Even on death row, Galvan remained a figure of notoriety, a living symbol of the failure of containment and the persistent reach of gang authority, challenging assumptions about safety, punishment, and the human capacity for violence. By the mid-2000s, Robert Phantom Galvan had settled into San Quentin's death row, but his story remained far from static. Condemned to die, yet untouched by execution, he became a living contradiction, a man legally sentenced to death but physically existing in one of the most controlled environments in California. The state's moratorium on executions transformed his punishment from a definitive end into an extended limbo. Death row is designed to contain the most dangerous individuals. Cells are small and heavily fortified. Movement is restricted. Interaction with other inmates is minimal. Guards patrol constantly, armed and alert. For most inmates, the isolation is absolute, the environment punitive, and the reality unavoidable. Death looms as both sentence and inevitable fate. For Galvan, the environment was different. His notoriety preceded him. Stories of his gang influence, prison violence, and courtroom assault made him an infamous figure within San Quentin and across the California Department of Corrections. Guards and inmates alike recognized that this was not just another death row inmate. This was a man whose reputation had been earned on the streets and cemented behind bars. During this period, Galvan also participated in several media interviews and documentaries, including segments on Sky News and NPR, where he discussed conditions on death row and the gradual integration of condemned inmates into the general prison population. These appearances revealed a man who understood his own legend, yet also offered rare insight into life under permanent threat of execution. A life marked by hyper-surveillance, isolation, and constant negotiation with the unspoken hierarchies of prison life. California's moratorium on executions, while politically motivated, had practical consequences for someone like Galvan. It meant that the state's ultimate tool for eliminating a threat, a tool justified in his case by repeated lethal violence, was effectively suspended. In practical terms, he was sentenced to die, but death itself remained deferred. The system could contain him, but it could not conclude his story. His continued existence on death row also raised broader questions for corrections, officials, lawmakers, and criminologists. How do you manage inmates whose danger is both proven and ongoing? How does the prison system balance punishment, security, and human rights when the execution of the sentence is indefinitely delayed? And for a figure like Galvan, whose life had already been punctuated by violence and escape from control, what meaning remained in confinement without closure? Within gang culture, Galvan's continued presence symbolized resilience and authority. Fresno Bulldogs members still regarded him as a prominent figure, a reminder that leadership is not always dependent on physical proximity. His name persisted in the streets, influencing dynamics even from within the walls of San Quentin. In many ways, Galvan became a case study for the complexities of modern corrections, the intersection of gang influence, extreme violence, and the limitations of capital punishment in practice. He exists at a crossroads between punishment and containment, between law and chaos, between life and the death sentence he is condemned to endure. The story of Robert Galvan is therefore not just about one man's crimes or even his death sentence. It is about the system itself, its vulnerabilities, and the consequences of underestimating individuals whose capacity for violence surpasses the constraints of law and architecture. Even decades after his initial convictions and years after his murder behind bars, Galvan's story continues to challenge assumptions about prison, punishment, gang culture, and the ultimate question: can society ever truly neutralize someone like the Phantom of Fresno? As of 2025, Robert "Phantom" Galvan remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, a figure frozen in time by California's moratorium on executions. Condemned yet alive, he embodies a paradox that haunts the state's correctional system. A man whose capacity for violence has been repeatedly demonstrated, yet who continues to exist under the watchful eyes of guards, lawyers, and the media. Galvan's story extends beyond his personal history of crime. It is inseparable from the Fresno Bulldogs, the gang whose reach he helped cement both on the streets and inside prisons. The Bulldogs have long been the dominant criminal force in Fresno, shaping local drug markets, enforcing territorial disputes, and perpetuating cycles of violence. Galvan's notoriety, both as a purported shot caller and as a murderer within prison walls, solidified his influence. Even decades later, his name carries weight in gang networks, a reminder that incarceration cannot fully sever the ties of loyalty, fear, or command. Inside San Quentin, life is regimented, yet Galvan's presence remains a point of concern. Death row inmates are isolated, movement is restricted, and interactions are tightly controlled. But the risk he poses has forced correctional staff to maintain heightened vigilance. His case serves as an ongoing study in risk management, prison security, and the challenges of handling inmates whose danger transcends confinement. Beyond the walls, Galvan has engaged with media. Documentaries and interviews, such as those featured on Sky News and NPR, have allowed him to articulate the reality of death row life, the hierarchy of prison culture, and the challenges of being a condemned inmate navigating the rules of survival. These appearances are rare windows into a world largely hidden from public view, but they also reinforce his infamy, a living example of how one individual can influence both peers and public perception from behind bars. Galvan's existence raises enduring questions about the justice system. What does a death sentence mean when it may never be carried out? How should society manage someone whose violence has proven unstoppable, even under extreme confinement? And perhaps most urgently, what lessons can be learned about the intersection of gang power, prison authority, and legal punishment when one man defies every expectation? Ultimately, Robert Galvan's story is a cautionary tale. It is a story about control that fails, punishment that may be insufficient, and the persistence of influence in spaces designed to eliminate it. It is also a story about the blurred lines between myth and reality, between the street legend of the Phantom and the man behind bars whose actions have forced the state to confront its limits. As the years continue, Galvan remains both a symbol and a threat, a reminder that in the world of gangs and prisons, some figures are too dangerous to ignore, and some lessons are learned only in hindsight. The Phantom of Fresno may never walk free, but neither does his legacy fade. It lingers in the streets, in the prison yards, and in the courts that struggled and continue to struggle to contain him.